स्टडी IQ IAS, अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल।
Welcome to StudyIQ's initiative, the podcast. I am your host, Dipansh Murjani. Tighten your belts, it is time for the podcast of the day. In the last episode, we discussed about democracy in detail. All our new listeners, for taking their preparation journey to another level, can listen to our previous episodes. In today's podcast, we will talk about separation of power. Sir, in most of the democratic countries, we see division of power. Sir, what is the meaning of separation of power and how it is related to democracy?
Democratic countries have a system of government in which the powers are divided among various branches which control different facets of government. India, being a democratic country, has its power divided into branches, namely legislative, executive and judiciary, known as called the trias politica model, with each branch having its separate independent power and responsibilities.
There are three branches or levels of democracy. Sir, can you throw some light on these branches and their features?
Separation of power is the mechanism of governance in three branches, as specified above: legislative, executive and judiciary. Three basic features of this division are: each organ should have different persons in capacity. One organ should not interfere in functioning of the other organ. That is, there shall be independency of power. Third, one organ should not exercise a function of another. Separation of power prevents misuse of power, accumulation of power in few hands. Separation of power safeguards the society from arbitrary and irrational power of the state. Now let us understand each of these branches separately. Legislature is the law-making body. It has the authority to make laws for a political entity such as country. Law enacted by the legislature is usually known as primary legislation. Legislature forms the base for the functioning of the other two organs. Second, executive. Executive is the administrative head of the government, which includes Prime Minister, Chief Minister, President, governors, etc. Executive is completely dependent on the powers the legislature grants it, and the actions of the executive may or may not be subject to judicial review. Third organ is judiciary. The judiciary is the watchdog of democracy, as it guards the constitution. The judiciary comprises of the Supreme Court, the High Court, District Court and the subordinate courts to it.
Sir, after your explanation, now we know the functions of branches in democracy. However, a question arises as to why do we need this separation of power?
Concentration of power in one center or authority can lead to maladministration, corruption, nepotism, and it may lead to abuse of power. That's why separation of power helps in: number one, preventing autocracy, create efficient administration. Independency of power is also maintained. It also prevents the legislature from enacting arbitrary or unconstitutional laws.
Sir, if separation of powers is followed in India, then what are the constitutional provisions which imply the separation of power in our country?
The doctrine of separation of power is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution. Although not specifically mentioned, the legislature cannot pass a law violating this principle. The function of the three organs are specifically mentioned in Constitution. Let us look at some of the articles of Constitution which suggest separation of powers. First article is Article 50. This article puts an obligation over the state to separate the judiciary from the executive. But since this falls under the directive principles of state policy, it is not enforceable. The next article is Article 123. It is very famously known for ordinance. In this article, the President, being the executive head of the country, is empowered to exercise legislative powers, that means to promulgate ordinances in certain conditions. The next article where separation of power is mentioned are under Article 121 and 211. These provides that the legislatures cannot discuss the conduct of judge of Supreme Court or High Court. They can do so only in the case of impeachment. The next important article to show the separation of power is Article 361, in which the President or Governor enjoys immunity from the court proceedings.
There are three different organs, namely legislature, executive and judiciary. Sir, as you had mentioned that there is independency of function between these organs, but is it so that these organs never interfere in the functioning of each other?
There is a system of checks and balances wherein the various organs impose checks on one another by certain provisions. First, the judiciary has the power of judicial review over the actions of executive and legislatures. The judiciary has the power to strike down any law passed by the legislature if it is unconstitutional or arbitrary as per Article 13, if it violates fundamental right basically. It can also declare unconstitutional executive actions as void. The legislature also reviews the functioning of executives. Although the judiciary is independent, the judges are appointed by the executive. The legislature can also alter the basis of the judgment while adhering to the constitutional limitation. Checks and balances ensures that no one organ becomes all too powerful. The Constitution guarantees that the discretionary power bestowed on any one organ is within the democratic principle. To understand this, we will take a look at Supreme Court's judgment, which is Keshwananda Bharti versus State of Kerala. The Supreme Court held that the amending power of Parliament is subject to the basic structure and features of the Constitution. So, any amendment which is violating the basic features will be declared unconstitutional.
We can say that for a healthy democracy, separation of power becomes one of the mandatory features. Sir, thank you for giving us the information. Dear listeners, we will call it quits for this episode. We will be back very soon with another episode of the podcast. Till then, stay tuned with StudyIQ. Keep studying. You can listen to this podcast on various audio streaming platforms such as Hubhopper, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast and Kuku FM. Links are pinned in the comment section below. Thank you.